Today, if you tried the other two and couldn't get a sound, that's why this one says third try. I'm trying to get it right. I actually rebooted my computer to see if that would help. And so I'm kind of waiting for somebody to chime in and say, okay, they can hear me and see me and all of those things. But I don't know why this doesn't work. On some days, it just doesn't work. I do the exact same thing every time. And so it really throws me off because I'm not real technical when things don't work the way they're supposed to. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start talking. If they come back and say there's no sound again, then I will have to try tomorrow after having somebody work on it. So I'll look to see if people tell me whether there's sound or not. And it's fixed. All right. Thank you, Leo. I appreciate that. And so First Timothy chapter 5, verses 9 to 16, he's going to introduce to us a rather controversial subject because of the cultural difference that was in the time that the Bible was written here and the way culture functions in America today. There is so many dynamics that were different. The main one is that in the time that the Bible was written, there was a real community aspect in the culture. In other words, travel was limited to foot or a donkey or a camel, maybe a horse, but travel was very limited. And because of that, people were very community driven. And because they were very community oriented, they knew everything about everyone. They knew who was where and what was going on, and nobody was very far from anyone, and they interacted a lot. Well, today the world is so small that you can travel. My wife and I went to Florida for a couple of days, and we flew out on Thursday. We flew back on Saturday. And if we were to even take a car, it would have been an entire day driving there, an entire day driving back, and to walk would almost be impossible. And so we live in a day today where it's way different in our culture than what it was then, and so sometimes the applications create some difficulty. And so, but the principles are very clear here. They're hard to wrestle through as to which widows did the church care for and what was required in order for the church to care for them or the church to just let them go. We kind of live in a world of equality where we think if you're a widow, then everyone's a widow. And if you're a widow, then you qualify because you're a widow. And that's the way it should be. And if you're going to be fair, you got to treat every widow the same, regardless of their behavior, regardless of their age, regardless of their background, regardless of what scripture says they should do. We kind of live in a world today where no, they should just be equal. Well, the cultural impact does not dictate Bible truth. Really, the Bible truth should impact the culture. However, in interpreting principles, we have to understand to whom it was written. We have to understand the culture in whom it was written in order to make accurate applications. And so I do understand the challenge of it, but let me give you the principles because they're very clear and very direct and maybe a little abrasive even in how they come across. And so I'll read them to you and then do my best to explain it to you. Verse number 9, let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old. In other words, if she was not 60 or older, she was not included in the care of the church for the widow. And you say, why 60? I don't know. That was just the number. And so it was clear that there was an age limit. And so if you were younger than 60, the church did not care for you. Your family could, but you were actually encouraged to remarry. And so well reported of. So here is this lady. She's been the wife of one man. well reported of for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she had washed the saints' feet, if she had relieved the afflicted, if she had diligently followed every good work. In other words, this widow needed to be a servant in the church, and she had to be a caretaker of her home. She had to care for her children. She had to be hospitable to strangers, which is different in our culture. They can get a hotel today and almost prefer that, where things are much different, but we can still be hospitable in our own culture. But really, the emphasis is she needed to do the work of what the ladies did in the church, to minister, to serve, to care. And so if she hadn't done those things, if she wasn't 60 years old or older and wasn't a servant in the church, then she just didn't qualify. And so then it goes on, but the younger widows refuse. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. And withal, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some are already turned aside after Satan. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. So he's re-emphasizing what we talked about yesterday, and that is, if you have a widow in your family, then take care of her. You care for her, so the church doesn't have to. And but if you just can't, or there isn't anyone to take care of her, then the church will, as long as they qualify. And so the qualifier was 60 years old or older, and that they were servants in the church. They were already actively participating in acts of service, caring for their home, ministering to their children, caring for strangers, helping with the afflicted, serving. The washing of feet is this idea of serving, meeting the needs of people within the church. If they just weren't servants, if they just weren't actively participating in the good work of the church, then they just didn't qualify. That sounds harsh. That sounds mean in our culture today, but they were adamant about it in the Bible days. And then the other thing they were adamant about is that if they were under 60, then they should marry. And the reason is because in this culture, there was no Social Security. There wasn't any 401k. There wasn't any retirement programs. There wasn't any of that. And so what happens is this woman is going to need to eat. This woman is going to need a place to stay, and she's going to have to be able to pay to care for herself and her children. And what's going to be a temptation is that she's going to have to go through whatever means that is necessary in order to do that, which is really marry and have a husband who's going to take care of her, because the culture obviously was not loaded with women in the workforce. Now, there were women who were able to do things. They the Proverbs 31 woman would buy a field, and she would plant her garden, and she would sell her sewing, and she could do some things. And there's no doubt that some of these widows could do that as well. But the idea is that she's going to get wore out doing all of the things that her husband was doing to care for her family, to meet the needs of the family, if she's doing it all. And so the emphasis was, let her marry again and marry somebody who will take care of her. Well, this is way different in our culture today. Today, you can apply, you get your husband's Social Security. You may have a 401 plan. The woman may have a very good job on her own. There may be many means for her to take care of herself, and there's life insurance, and there's all kinds of things today, way different back in the culture of when this was written and in this early church time. And so it's really hard to just compare apples to apples here. But what are the principles that are clear? Number one is that if the church is to take care of the widow, she needs to have had a testimony of being faithful to the Lord, faithful with her role, and faithful in the context of our culture, faithful in the context of the responsibilities today. And if they've shirked those responsibilities, or if they have lived for the world, if they have given themselves to their own desires rather than Christ's desires, if they've followed their own dreams rather than God's designs, well, then they're on their own to keep doing that. But the church can get a black eye in a hurry if you're not caring for them, and yet the scripture is clear. The church is really only required to care for widows who have been servants to the Lord. And so that's an important part, is that we faithfully serve the Lord, not so that if our husband dies that we can we can have the church take care of us. We serve the Lord because it's right, it's his design, it's our privilege. And yet the church has a responsibility. But also the idea here was that if you're younger than 60, then just remarry. Well, today we have all kinds of means where the wife is not under the pressure to need to remarry, even though she may be younger, because of life insurance, because she might be able to provide for her own self and her children with a job. There might be a Social Security aspect. And so we have all kinds of other dynamics that really is different for the emphasis of the younger remarrying. Let her remarry. But the other side is that God's design is that people be complete. And so for someone who being married and then losing their spouse needs that completion, they ought not wander around. They ought not fill their time as a busybody with selfish endeavors or selfish desires, but rather to make sure they follow God's design of completion, which is their freedom to remarry. And so there's all kinds of dynamics going on here that makes this a little bit confusing for people. But let's just remember this, that in our culture, the principle is this: when the family can care for a widow, they should. And if they just can't, or if there's no family to do it, the church does care for them. But they should care for the widows who have been faithful to the Lord. And so that is really the emphasis, is Paul is reminding Timothy that there is this aspect of church ministry, but there's also a responsibility that is laid upon these widows as it relates to faithful service to the Lord. So that's the best way. I know it's a difficult thing, and we had a hard time getting it started today, but that's the scriptural principle. I hope it's a help and encouragement to you, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. God bless.